Hi everybody and welcome to Console Land. Today on the channel we're going to be doing an AV composite mod on this Atari 2600, and before we begin please don't forget to like, subscribe and leave any comments below. So if you are a fan of the channel, you'd have watched my Atari 2600 retro review a few weeks ago, and a friend of mine, Scott, did exactly that. And in that video I mentioned that the console that I have has been AV modded to allow me to play it composite out, so I can use it through my PVM rather than the traditional RF out that the 2600 is made with. So it's a fairly straightforward process. You do need a little bit of skill with soldering, but not too much. Scott asked me if I would do his, and I thought that would be a good opportunity to do a video to show you guys how it's done. Before I do begin the video, please, if you aren't confident with soldering, don't try this at home, and I take no responsibility if you do and break your console. Okay, so let's take a look at what you're going to need to complete this mod. Obviously you're going to need a soldering iron, and to go with that you're going to need some solder and some copper strip board, which you can buy from Amazon, and I'll come on to that in a second, what exactly that's used for. Some 2.2k ohm resistors and a 3.3k ohm resistor and a transistor with the model number 2N3904, and I'll repeat that again a bit later in the video. Also you're going to need some wire to complete this mod, some side cutters, some flux, and I have a flux pen, the scalpel, and I use that scalpel to clean up the lines on the board. Again, you'll see me do that a bit later on as well. It's just a standard Phillips screwdriver and a small amount of double-sided tape to stick the board to the console once you've made the board itself. I'm using two soldering irons here, slightly thicker nib on this one and a fine nib on the other soldering iron that I have, but you can do this with one soldering iron if you haven't got two. So removing the case on these old 2600s are quite straightforward. All you need is a Phillips screwdriver, and there's 6 screws that you need to begin by unscrewing, but not the 2 there that you can see on the top. So we take the 2 from the front, the 2 from the back, and the 2 from the back at the top here. So we just unscrew those. It's also worth noting that the screws at the front here that I'm taking now are slightly different from the rest of them, and you can tell which ones are which because the screws that come out the front of the console have a slight point to them and the other ones are kind of stubby screws. But again, it's worth mentioning, don't take out the 2 screws from the top of the console. We need those left in just for now. Once you've done that, flip it over and you should just be able to prise the lid off the console, and everything else should stay in place. There's no wires or anything attached to this, it's just a plastic lid, and you can put that to one side, and we'll come back to that a bit later on when we come to put it back all together again. There's also 2 screws here that you need to undo, one on either side of this metal shield, and here is the RF modulator that we're going to be removing. We can start by unplugging that and feeding it out the hole of the back of the console, and we just pull the end through, and we don't need that cable anymore, we can dispose of that. And we'll show you how to take off this RF modulator very soon. For now we take off these 2 screws either side of the cartridge slot. Don't forget to keep all these screws somewhere nice and safe so you can remember which ones are which. Once you've undone those 2 screws, you just unplug the ribbon cable at the back of the switch unit. Should come unplugged quite easily, and then just lift off the top part and just set that to one side for now. We're going to be coming back to that very soon. And that's the console stripped. Okay, now we're going to move on to the RF modulator. There's a couple of ways that you can take this RF modulator off. You can either unsolder it or desolder it, which you'll need a solder remover for. If you haven't got one of those, there's other ways you can take it off. One way you can take it off is to use side cutters and cut the soldered joints that you can see from the side that will release the RF module. Worth bearing in mind, we're not keeping any of this module, so you can just cut it out if you want to. I'm choosing to desolder it, and I'm going to speed up this process so that we're not watching a bit too much boring soldering. So there's between 4 or 5 solder joints that you need to remove. The 2 that you saw me just remove, the 2 that I'm currently removing, and then there's another 2 or 3 connections that are smaller joints that make up the actual ground, positive and video signal that we will be using a bit later on in the video. Just keep desoldering and moving the module to prise it loose, and eventually once you've got everything removed it should just fall out. Well, there you go, the module is released. Again, we don't need this, we can just put that in the bin and carry on. So to make our board, we're using copper strip, or it might be called prototype board, sometimes called prototype board, and we're using a piece that is 9 holes by 9 holes basically, which is 9 strips basically wide. So it's worth mentioning with this this board, only one side of it has copper and the other side is just has no copper. So you mount your components on the side that has no copper, so the legs of the components will come through the copper part that you can solder on. The board is separated into lines, so you can solder on different channels, and again we're using sort of vertically, which you'll see as we move along in the video, and I'll put a diagram up exactly what we're going to be doing, which makes a bit more sense in just a second. Okay, so here we have our circuit diagram. Now you may want to pause on this screen to have a look and familiarize yourself with it properly, but you can see the copper strips that are going vertically down. The color dots are the color coded wires. We have a transistor at the top there with its base, collector and emitter, and the 2 resistors. I'll leave the diagram in the bottom right hand corner of the screen so you can refer back to it if you need to. But first of all, here's a transistor that we're going to attach to our board. It's a 2N3904 transistor. For those of you who don't know how transistors work, if we hold it with the flat side up, it's got a curved edge and a flat side. If we hold the flat side up, the left hand pin as you look at it now is the collector, the center pin is the base, and the right hand pin is the emitter. And basically what that means is the base is where you would put your signal coming in, and the emitter is the signal going out, and the collector is where you would connect your positive signal to power the transistor. So we stick that in the board, and as per our diagram, we leave 1 track gap in between each leg. So we're just going to solder that in place now. Again, I'm using my flux pen just to get a better stick on the solder. And just do 3 sort of small dots of solder just to hold those legs in place. You'll see me use the scalpel. Sometimes I clean up between the tracks in case I go over any solder. You don't have to be the best solderer in the world, but it helps if you've done a little bit of soldering before. Snip the legs off to tidy the job, and that's not a bad job to start with. So now we're going to take our next resistor, which is the 2.2k ohms, and that's going to go underneath the legs of the transistor, leaving 1 line gap horizontally across that we can run our wires into. So as again, if you keep referring back to that diagram, that will make sense. So one end of this will go onto the baseline of our printed circuit board, and the other end of this 2.2k resistor will go on our collector line of our transistor and circuit board. And again, once it's in place, we just tip it upside down and we clean the connections on the other side once we've soldered them. And again, just snip off the legs when they're done. But again, as you can see from the picture there, or the video there, the 1/2 of the 2.2k ohm resistor goes on the base and the other goes to the collector pin. Now we get our 3.3k ohm resistor, and the connections for this are one side goes to the base of the transistor, and the other side of it will go to the pin to the left, or the track to the left of the collector track. Again, keep referring back to that diagram and it should make sense as you go. Worth mentioning at the moment, while we're talking about this, that whilst transistors that we put in earlier do have a polarity that depends on which way they have to go around, resistors, either the 2.2 or the 3.3, you can put in either direction, whichever way around you want, as long as they follow the track diagram that I put up earlier. So let's just pop that in there, put some flux on it and solder it all together. It's actually really important to try and remember to use flux when you're soldering, just because it gives you a neater connection and make sure the solder flows on there nicely. Again, snip those ends of the legs of the resistor off, and there you go, they're all in place. And that's the components pretty much done. So as I mentioned before, the base pin on the transistor connects in line with both pins on both resistors, and then one resistor goes to the collector pin and the other pin goes to the pin the strip just to the left of the collector strip. Now we're going to get our wire. I'm using blue, green, black and red wire. You can use whatever color code you want, but just refer back to my diagram from earlier to see where the cables go. We're going to strip off the blue, which we're going to use later on for the audio, but for now we can put that to one side and just focus on the green, the red and the black. For the purpose of this video, the red cable is positive, the green is video and the black is ground, and all I'm doing at the moment is tinning the cables. And what I mean by tinning is you put a little bit of flux on the end of the stripped wire, and then you just put a tiny blob of solder which neatens the end of the wire, so it makes it easier to push through the holes on the board to solder on the other side. It's just the correct way of soldering wires to boards. Okay, now we're going to put our cables, solder our cables to the board. The first cable we're going to put on is the green, which is our video cable, and we're going to attach that to the base stripe on the new circuit board, the base strip which connects to the base of the transistor. Here's the diagram again on screen so you can see. The green wire is going to go to the base pin or the base strip. The red wire is going to go to the collector strip or the collector pin, and the black wire is going to go to the pin next to the collector, which is where our 3.3 ohm resistor goes to. Just take your time, make sure that you keep the tracks in between each connector clean. You don't want to short out your console or the board and have nothing working at the end of this. You just make sure everything's clean and the solder joints don't go between the vertical tracks. So once we've done our inputs, we're then got to do our output cables. So we take another piece of the cable, and what I'm doing here actually is preparing the bottom of the board for the output cable, just by putting a little bit of flux and tinning the ends of the board here, just so we get a good connection. Again, worth mentioning, don't put too much solder on there because you don't want to block the holes. You just want enough to tin them so it makes it easier to solder onto. So now we cut off a piece for our output cables. These two cables that I've cut off need to be about 8 inches each. We strip back. This time we don't use the red wire. We can discard that. We only use the red wire on the inputs because there is only one power input to this board, which we've already connected. We're keeping the blue again, which is our audio, and we're going to use the black and the green now, which is our video and our ground, and we're going to attach those to the board, and we're going to tin those first. So the cables have now been tinned, and we're going to connect our green to our emitter pin or emitter strip on our board, and we're going to connect our black cable to the ground strip, which is sitting in line with our 3.3k ohm resistor. Again, just keep referring back to that diagram that I had on screen earlier, and this will all make perfect sense. Just don't forget to, as you're going, make sure your strips are all clean. I can't emphasize it enough, you don't want to get a short at all. So we solder those cables in place. And we're almost finished. All we need to do now, again, is just make sure everything's cleaned, and we've got to add the blue audio cables. Okay, so with the blue cables, they pretty much just go onto a track of their own, and they're just a straight through connection really. You could, if you wanted to, just use one cable from the main board to the actual output if you wanted to, but I just think it's neater if it all goes through the circuit board, and it just ties things in a bit better. So again, we'll just use the same method, tinning those ends and connect them onto the board. And again, you'll see on the diagram it's the furthest pin to the left, or the furthest strip to the left, but you can actually do it on any of the strips that are spare. One last tidy up to make sure there's no solder between the joins. One last check to make sure that the board looks like it does in the diagram, and that's the board made. Okay, so now it's time to connect our AV board to the switchboard of the Atari 2600. There's 5 small holes on the left hand side where the RF modulator used to be. There's a blown up picture of after I've connected the circuit. The first small hole is for the negative or the ground wire. The second hole is left empty. The third hole should be for our positive, the red cable for the input. And the fourth hole is for the green video input cable that we see on our circuit diagram from before, and the fifth hole is left blank. So the first is ground, second is empty, third is the red positive, fourth is the green video, and the fifth is left empty. So all we do is feed the cable, or prepare the end of the cable by tinning them, pop them through the hole, and solder onto the back of the switchboard. Once you've done all 3 of the cables and made sure they're not soldered between, you can just snip the ends off and tie them up, and that's that done. So now the main board. We now get the base of our console again and undo those 2 screws that we left on from earlier. And be careful now when you lift this back up, because now the main board chassis itself is free. Undo the screws that are holding the protective covering. Put those to one side. And then pop the cover off, put that to one side. And there's 2 screws that hold the actual main board into the chassis and the opposite end to the input, so just undo those 2 screws and then carefully lift out the main board from the chassis. Put the case into one side, and here you have the main board. So there's a few components we're going to remove now. You can see on the picture on the left hand side we're going to remove the red component there. We're going to remove a black transistor. Both of those that are circled and crossed are going to be removed, and all you do for these is just unsolder them from the other side, or desolder them from the other side of the board, and they pop off. The transistor, you can, if you want to, just cut the legs on the transistor rather than desoldering it. It's entirely up to you. So you'll see on the bottom left hand picture as well, there's a circled leg or pad on the bottom left hand corner of the screen. That's where we're going to connect our sound to. and here's the blue wire connecting to that little pad that we just mentioned. It's worth noting at this point that the pad that you're going to solder the blue cable onto is pad number C210. So as you can see from the bottom left hand picture, that's the after. It goes to pad number C210. So what we do is prepare our blue cable, tin the end. We need to thread all the or thread the cable through the top of the chassis now, through the holes already existing in the chassis, and then we're going to solder it to C210. Just a simple blob of solder, and hold the cable in place so it sets and goes hard, and that's it done. Once it's in place, we can just pop the board back into the chassis and screw it all back down. So we've connected our blue cable from our input side of the board onto the C210 pad, and we're going to pop these screws back in now, and we're going to put the casing together. Once you've actually got all these connections soldered, they can withstand a bit of movement and being pulled around, so they're not too fragile, so don't worry about moving it around too much. It should be able to withstand it. Pop the casing back on. And do the screws back up again. And now we're going to attach the switchboard back onto the side of the cartridge casing. At this point we're not going to secure the switchboard yet with the screws, we're just going to leave them loose, but we are going to attach our circuit board to the switchboard with some double-sided tape. So we just cut a piece of tape about 1 inch or so long, peel off the backing and attach our little circuit board to that firmly. That should hold it in place, and then all we do now is we feed the wires through to make sure they're not snagging on anything, and just whichever path you choose to take, whether it be underneath the board, around the side of it, between the gap between the switchboard and the cartridge slot, as I'm doing here, but whichever way, there's a lot of space inside the Atari 2600 once you've got the lid on, so either way doesn't matter. Just tidy your cables up, make sure everything's out of the way, and then we're going to move on to the next step. Okay, so one thing that I left off of our list of required items earlier, and is actually very important, is our actual sockets that go on the back of the console. So they're just called RCA sockets, and they have a threaded screw there that you drill a hole through the back of your console and thread all these through, and then there's a little metal tab that you can solder your ground connection onto in a second. And I'll show you a picture of what that looks like once it's on the back of the console, and you'll see what it all means. Drill 2 holes in the back of the console, just around about where your RF box used to come out of, and then you'll be able to fit these 2 sockets and solder the cables to them. So we're preparing the little tabs that are on the ground side of the sockets, the RCA sockets, and we're putting some flux on the center pins as well. And now we're going to solder a loop cable, which is like a little black small cable between the 2 grounds of the sockets. I will show you a picture of what this looks like afterwards in just a second, so you can see exactly the way it should look. And all we're doing now is just soldering our tabs ready to be connected to those black cables. So because it's a common ground, the audio and the video share a common ground, we're just going to do a bridge cable between the two. And for that we just need a small length of black cable that we cut earlier. Cut that down to about 2 or 3 inches. Strip the ends, prepare them, and then solder them onto the ground tabs of our RCA connections. So that's one side done, and the other side. Again, I will show you a picture of this once it's completed. It's not a very good angle here, but you'll be able to see exactly the way it should look in just a second. So that's that done. Once that is complete, you then need to take one of your cables, your black cable from your board, and connect it to the one of the ground pins that you just soldered on. So now I've only got 3 more cables to solder. Again, just make sure everything's threaded through, not snagging, and now we're going to solder the outputs from our chip into the terminals on the RCA connectors. Start with our black cable, and we're going to solder the black cable onto the one of the ground tabs that we've just already put on the back of our console, doesn't matter which one. And then once you've got the ground in place, all you do is solder the center pin of the video just here to the green cable, and the center pin of the audio to our blue cable just here. Once you finish that, it should look like this. So you can see we've got our little ground loop that we put in there, our black ground cable coming from our circuit board on the one of the ground pins, the green coming from our circuit board, which is video, onto the center of the video pin, and the blue coming from our circuit board, which is going to the center of the audio pin. Now time to just check one last final check to make sure, before we put everything back together, to make sure all the cables are secure, all going to the right places. Our inputs are coming from our switchboard, outputs are going to our RCA connections, and that blue cable is coming from our console circuit board. Once you're happy that everything's okay, just connect everything up, use the ribbon cable, plug that into the top of the switchboard, and then use the 2 screws that you removed earlier to secure that switchboard back into place. So once you've got that main board back into place, we can now put the lid back on. When you're putting the lid back on the console, it's worth trying to line up the cartridge slot with the metal casing underneath it to make sure the cartridges will actually slot in nice and easy in the future. So just make sure the black plastic is lined up with the metal, and try and hold it in place with one hand whilst you screw the screws in the underneath, just to make sure that it will all function nicely and sits together in the future. Might take a little bit of adjustment to start with, but you should get there in the end. Don't forget, when you're screwing everything back together, just make sure that you use the 2 pointy screws at the front of the console and all the other stubby screws at the same length for all of the other screw holes. And again, just making sure everything lines up as you're putting it all together. Once all your screws are back in place, that's the mod complete. All you need to do now is connect it up to your TV and spend hours playing Atari 2600 games in glorious composite connection. If you found the tutorial useful, please come back and visit again on Console Land, and please don't forget to subscribe, like and comment below.